She gave him a decade. He gave the crown to someone else. That moment, that cold, deliberate humiliation in front of thousands, wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. And what Kyle Draven never understood, what men like him never understand, is that the woman they discard is rarely the one who falls. She's the one who walks. And everything they built, everything they took credit for, it walks with her. Stay until the end. You'll want to see every piece of this kingdom come apart. And drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my wolves are watching from. Balsaud. The Moon Festival came once a year, and it came with teeth. Not the polished kind the court dressed itself in. The silks and ceremonial armor and powdered white faces of nobles who hadn't seen a battlefield in 2 generations. Real teeth. The kind that had been ground down over 10 years of war negotiations conducted in cold rooms, supply lines managed through droughts, border alliances maintained by letters written at midnight because Kyle was too proud to ask for help, and too arrogant to admit he needed someone who knew how to ask. Luna Everly Draven had those teeth, even when she smiled. She was smiling now, standing at the tall copper mirror in her private chambers, while her attendant Mira fastened the last clasp on her ceremonial robe. The fabric was deep midnight blue, embroidered at the hem with silver thread that caught light like a second moon. Everly watched her own face in the glass with the detached attention of someone cataloging a weapon before deployment. High cheekbones. The pale, steady eyes of a woman who had learned to sleep lightly and think hard. A jaw that had never once trembled in public. "You look extraordinary," Mira said quietly. The girl was 19 and had served Everly since she was 16. She knew what ordinary compliments meant, and she knew when she wasn't giving one. "I look like a Luna," Everly said, "which is what tonight requires." "You're not nervous." "I haven't been nervous in 6 years." Everly touched the silver moon crown where it rested on its stand. 3 pounds of forged silver with jagged peaks meant to suggest the mountain range that formed the kingdom's northern spine. She had worn it so long that she could feel its weight even when it wasn't on her head. "Hand me the crown." Mira lifted it carefully and held it out. Everly settled it into place herself. Always herself. She had never let anyone else do that, not since the day Kyle put it on her head at the bonding ceremony and fumbled with the pins and laughed it off like it was charming. She hadn't found it charming. She had found it instructive. Kyle Draven, at his core, did not pay attention to the details. She did. That difference had built his kingdom. Outside the chamber windows, the capital city of Ashenvale was already burning with celebration. Torches in every alley, the distant percussion of drums from the lower wards where the common wolves were feasting on the grain stores that Everly had negotiated from the eastern granaries 3 months ago. She had traded a defensive treaty with Alpha Garrett Moss of the Stoneback Pack, 3 years of hunting rights along the northern ridge, and a very carefully worded letter that made Garrett feel respected rather than leveraged. Kale had signed the final document. Kale had taken the credit at the Spring Council. She had been standing 4 feet behind him when he did it. She thought about that now, not with bitterness. Bitterness was a drain on focus, and she had trained herself out of it the way soldiers trained out of flinching. She thought about it analytically, the way she thought about everything. Kyle accepted credit because Kyle understood credit as a resource, the same way he understood land and gold and soldiers. The credit flowed to him because the structure of the kingdom directed it there, and he had never examined whether that structure reflected reality. He had never needed to examine it. She had built the structure. "Luna," Mira's voice was careful, "the ceremony begins in an hour." "I know." "Will the Alpha King be escorting you to the platform?" Everly met Mira's eyes in the mirror. The girl knew something. Servants always knew something. They moved through the castle like water through rock, finding every crack. Mira had that careful look she got when she was worried and didn't know how to say it without overstepping. "Has there been talk?" Everly asked. Mira hesitated. 1 second. 2. "There's always talk, my Luna." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "There is a woman," Mira said finally, very quietly, the way people said true things they wished weren't true. "She's been housed in the East Wing guest chambers, the ones reserved for honored guests of the Alpha King. She arrived 6 weeks ago. I thought at first she was a political attachment, but the guards rotated off their usual post to serve her, the Alpha King's personal guards. Everly said nothing for a moment. She looked at her own face in the mirror, pale, steady, the crown catching the lamplight. She had known about the woman for 4 months. Not her name at first, not her face, just the pattern, the irregular hours, the rerouted correspondence, the specific kind of absence that Kael radiated when he returned from unscheduled trips east. Everly had served beside a military commander long enough to recognize the behavior of a man managing a secret, the same way she recognized the behavior of a supply chain under stress or an alliance approaching its breaking point. She had gathered the information the way she gathered all information, quietly, through the right people, without alerting anyone that she was gathering it. The woman's name was Celine Voss, 23 years old, daughter of a minor merchant family from the Velmark border region, unremarkable bloodline, no political alliance value. What she had was something harder to quantify and easier to underestimate, a particular kind of beauty that hit men like Kael in a specific place, the place where their confidence lived, the place that whispered to them that they deserved reward for the greatness they believed in absolutely. Everly had not confronted Kael. Not yet. Not because she was afraid of the confrontation. She had never been afraid of a conversation, no matter how bad the words were. She had waited because she was still gathering, still building the complete picture, still confirming what she suspected about how deep this went. She looked at Mira. Thank you for telling me. My Luna, it changes nothing about tonight. Everly turned from the mirror. Help me with the outer cloak. The walk to the festival grounds took her through the castle's main corridor, past the painted likenesses of every Alpha King and Luna who had held Ashenvale since the kingdom's founding. 43 rulers across 200 years. She knew all their names, all their significant decisions, the alliances they had built and the ones they had broken. History was another kind of intelligence network if you read it right. She had always read it right. Kael was at the end of the corridor, flanked by his 2 senior commanders, Aldrich, who ran the Western Military Division, and Holt, who handled the king's personal security. Both men straightened when they saw her. Aldrich gave the slight nod that was his version of warmth. Holt's expression remained precisely neutral, which meant he was managing something, which meant he knew something too. Kael himself was dressed for the ceremony in black and silver, the deep charcoal of the Alpha's formal jacket cut to emphasize the shoulders that had always been his best physical argument for authority. He was handsome and he knew it. He had always known it. In the early years before the war ground them both down to function, that particular brand of confident handsomeness had been something she'd felt in her chest, something she'd wanted. She had gone from wanting it to studying it so long ago she couldn't fix the exact moment. Everly. He said her name the way he said most things to her now. Efficiently, the pleasantries stripped out of it, a unit of address rather than an expression of anything. Kael. She matched his register precisely. Are you ready? I need a moment with you, before the ceremony. She looked at him. Aldrich and Holt both found reasons to study the floor. We have 40 minutes, she said. Walk with me. They fell into step together down the side passage that opened onto the castle's upper terrace, a narrow stone walkway that looked out over the festival grounds below and the city beyond it. From here, the torchlight turned everything amber and gold. Tens of thousands of wolves had come in from the outer territories, the towns and pack settlements and border camps, because the Moon Festival was the one night of the year when the kingdom felt like something they collectively owned. Everly had worked to make it feel that way. The grain distribution, the traveling healer companies, the permit exemptions that let small traders set up without the usual fees, all of it designed to bring people in, to make the festival mean something to common wolves who otherwise experienced the Alpha King's reign primarily as taxation and conscription notices. Kael stood beside her at the stone railing and looked out at the lights. I want to use tonight differently, he said. She waited. He was choosing words, which was unusual. Kael typically found words wherever they were when he needed them, approximate and sufficient. He was choosing these specifically. There's a woman, he said. Everly said nothing. Her name is Celine. She's been with me for... Stopped. She matters to me. In a way I didn't expect. And you want to announce that tonight, Everly said. Her voice was completely level. She had rehearsed nothing because she had known, on some level, that this moment was coming, and she had decided months ago how she would face it when it arrived. Not with a script, with clarity. I want to honor her publicly. Kael turned to face her. Tonight is the right moment. In front of the kingdom. Yes. She looked at him. You're telling me this 40 minutes before the ceremony. I didn't want... He stopped again. Something moved across his face. It was the closest thing she had seen to discomfort from him in years, and she recognized what it actually was. Not guilt, exactly. Not remorse. It was the calculation of a man who had already made a decision and was going through the motion of the conversation that should precede it, because the decision was already made and the conversation was a formality, and some part of him knew that, but not enough of him to stop. You expected me to cause a scene, she said. You told me now so I wouldn't have time to plan one. Kael's jaw tightened. I expected you to understand. You've always understood how this works. The kingdom needs... Don't tell me what's the kingdom needs. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. But something in it shifted, the way a current shifts under still water. And he heard it because even after everything, he knew her well enough to hear it. I built the treaties that keep this kingdom breathing. I negotiated the Eastern Grain Agreement you signed in spring. I managed the Hollow Creek border dispute for 3 months while you were consolidating the Western garrison, without a single soldier, using a combination of legal precedent and personal persuasion that you never read the full report on. Don't lecture me about what this kingdom needs. He stared at her. That's not what tonight is about. Then tell me what tonight is about, Kael. Plainly. A long pause. The drums in the lower wards pulsed upward through the stone, the city alive and waiting below them. It's about the fact that I love her, he said. And he said it the way people say true things that they know will hurt, with a kind of awful directness that was almost respect. And I want the kingdom to know it. Everly looked out over the lights. She thought about 10 years. She thought about the War Council where she had sat for 16 hours talking 3 Alpha commanders out of breaking the Northern Alliance. She thought about the winter the Eastern Wells failed, and she had personally coordinated the water distribution across 4 pack settlements, working from before dawn until past midnight, every day for 3 weeks, because the alternative was people dying, and Kael was managing a military campaign in the south, and she had never once suggested that the credit should be split differently. She thought about the bonding ceremony, when the crown went on her head and the crowd roared, and she felt, for one clear moment, that the work was worth it, that the sacrifice had built something real. She thought about all of it in the time it took her to breathe once, slowly, and set it down. All right, she said. Kael blinked. Go get ready for the ceremony. She turned away from the railing. I'll stand on the platform as planned. You do what you're going to do. We can discuss the rest afterward. She walked back through the corridor alone, past the 43 painted kings and queens, and she thought about something an old pack elder had told her once, back when she was very young and newly bonded, when she'd asked how you built something that lasted. You don't start with the top, he'd said. You start with the ground. You make the ground so strong that it can hold anything, and then, if the thing on top falls, the ground is still there. She had built the ground. The festival platform stood at the center of Ashenvale's great square, a raised stone dais 15 feet high, surrounded by torches mounted on iron poles that burned gold and white, the colors of the kingdom's banner. Stone steps ran up both sides. The crowd filled the square entirely, spilling into the surrounding streets, wolves from every corner of the territory pressed together in the amber heat. She could hear the breathing of 10,000 people, feel the collective warmth rising like a second fire. Everly took her position on the platform's left side, 3 feet from the throne. The throne was carved basalt, ancient and deliberately brutal, designed to communicate permanence through sheer mass. She had stood beside it hundreds of times. She knew every angle of the crowd from this position, knew which faces went with which pack, which cluster of nobles was which family, where the military commanders stood, and which of them were there out of loyalty versus obligation. She found Aldrich in the crowd. He found her eyes and held them for a moment with a look that was as close to grief as she had ever seen on the man's blunt face. She knew then. Whatever was about to happen was worse than she'd calculated. Kael mounted the platform from the right side. Behind him came Celine Voss. Everly looked at her. Young. That had been accurate. The kind of beautiful that arrived in a room ahead of the person wearing it, all wide, dark eyes and carefully arranged dark hair, and a face that understood its own power and had been trained to deploy it. She wore white. Her hands were steady. She had clearly been prepared for this moment with significantly more than 40 minutes of warning. The crowd registered her presence with a ripple, whispers traveling outward through the square like wind through wheat. People turned to neighbors. Questions spread. The nobles in the front ranks were very still with the particular stillness of people absorbing something they didn't yet understand. Kael took his position at the throne's center. He surveyed the crowd with the comfortable authority of a man who had never once questioned his right to stand in front of thousands and be heard. "People of Ashen Vale," he began, the words carrying across the square through sheer volume and the crowd's silence. "In the 10th year of my reign, I address you not only as your Alpha King, but as a man who has come to understand that the North requires more than strength. It requires truth." Everly stood 3 feet to his left and felt the very specific quality of the air around him. She had heard him give enough speeches to understand his rhythms, to feel the shape of what was coming. And she felt it now. The speech pivoting, the weight of it shifting, pointing. She kept her face completely still. "A kingdom is only as strong as the bonds that hold it. And the truest bond I know is the one that reveals a man fully, without armor, without calculation." He turned. He looked at Celine. Celine Voss came into my life at a moment when I had forgotten what it meant to feel something real. She reminded me. The crowd had stopped breathing. Kael lifted the royal cloak from his own shoulders. It was deep black, lined with white wolf fur, the Alpha's mark stitched in silver at the collar, the ceremonial garment reserved for the bonded queen, worn by the Luna at all formal proceedings. He held it in both hands with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed the gesture, and he walked to Celine Voss and placed it over her shoulders. "The true queen of this kingdom," he said. He was smiling, cold and certain and completely without apology, the smile of a man who had confused his own desire with justice. The silence that fell over Ashenvale's great square was the worst kind of silence. The kind that meant 10,000 people were all having the same thought simultaneously, and no one knew yet who was allowed to say it first. Everly did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing, 3 feet from the throne, in midnight blue embroidered with silver, the crown on her head, and she let the silence be silence. She felt the eyes come to her. Every eye in the square. Nobles, warriors, merchants, the common wolves packed into the back streets, who had climbed on each other's shoulders to see the platform. The senior military commanders in their dress uniforms, the pack leaders from the outer territories who had ridden 2 days to attend. She felt them all find her face, checking for the reaction, reading it the way a battlefield reader checks the wind. She gave them nothing. Not shock, not rage, not tears, not the frozen, open-mouthed collapse that the moment seemed designed to produce. She was aware of her own breathing, deep and controlled, aware of the crown's weight, aware of the exact position of her hands at her sides. Inside her chest, something was happening that she would not let reach her face. It was not surprise, which would have been naive. It was not grief, which would have required her to have expected something different from this man than what he had always fundamentally been. It was something colder and more complicated. The sensation of a calculation completing itself, of a number finally arriving that confirmed everything the preliminary work had been pointing toward. She had built this kingdom. Every treaty, every alliance, every quietly managed crisis. She had built the ground, and the man standing in front of her had just made his position about that ground perfectly clear. In the front rank of the noble gathering, she could see Lord Carvin, head of the most powerful Eastern family, a man whose trade agreement she had personally shepherded for 6 years, staring at her with an expression she recognized as dismay. Not outrage on her behalf. Dismay for himself, for what this meant, for what the morning would look like when the ramifications started landing. He understood, even now, what Kael did not. Beside Carvin, the pack leader Hester Crane from the Northern Reach had her arms crossed and her jaw set, and was looking at Kael the way experienced soldiers look at commanders who have just made a catastrophic tactical error, with a cold accounting that precedes the decision to stop following orders. Everly saw all of this. She logged it. She held it. Kael turned to face her, the crowd still holding its silence, and she could see in his face the expectation. He was waiting for something. Not cruelty. He wasn't watching for cruelty's sake. He was waiting for the confirmation that the move had worked, that the public nature of it had done what public things do to people who love the person wielding them, which is crush them into compliance. He expected her to stand there. He expected her to absorb it. He expected her to remain exactly where she was, because where she was, beside his throne, carrying his title, invested in his survival, was where she had always been, and people always stayed where they had always been when the alternative was loss. He expected her love to be a leash. Everly looked at him. For a long moment, just looked at him, with the pale, steady eyes that hadn't shown fear in 6 years and weren't showing it now. She thought about the first negotiation she had ever conducted alone, at 22, when she'd walked into a room of older men who all believed she was decorative and left 4 hours later with a trade agreement Kael had told her she'd never get. She thought about the look on those men's faces as they'd signed, not quite understanding what had happened, not quite able to say. She thought about what the ground looked like before you built on it, before anyone's name was attached to it, when it was just ground, strong, deep, unowned. She thought about all of it in the space of a single breath. Then Luna Everly Draven lifted one hand slowly and removed the silver moon crown from her head. She held it in both hands for a moment. 3 pounds of silver, every peak representing a mountain she had helped hold. She looked at it the way you look at a thing you built with care, a thing that cost you genuinely, a thing that was real and yours regardless of what name got attached to it. Then she placed it on the throne steps. Not thrown, not dropped. Set down precisely, at the exact center of the bottom step, with the controlled deliberateness of a woman who had rehearsed nothing and needed to rehearse nothing, because clarity was its own preparation. She looked up and found Kael's face. He had gone completely still. The cold certainty was gone. What was there instead was something she had never seen on him, something that lived between confusion and the first remote understanding of a terrible mistake. "I built this," she said. Her voice carried perfectly in the silence because she had never needed to shout. Every wall, every alliance, every treaty that kept wolves alive through the last 3 winters. She was not performing. She was not addressing the crowd. She was talking to him, directly, the way she had always talked to him when she needed him to understand something true. "You stood on what I built and called it yours. I let you, because I believed the work mattered more than the credit." She stepped back from the throne. 1 step, 2. Enough distance that there was air between her and everything she had built beside him. "I was wrong about that," she said. "Not about the work. About you." She turned and walked down the platform steps. The crowd parted. Not dramatically. Not the way crowds part in performances. The way crowds part for something that has weight and direction and isn't stopping. She walked through them in midnight blue with the crown's absence already shaping the air above her head, and she did not look back. And behind her, the silence cracked open like ice over spring water as the murmuring began. She was 3 steps from the edge of the square when she heard the first sound, a single voice from the crowd that she couldn't see. An older wolf, one of the northern pack leaders by the rough edge of the dialect. She built the grain agreement. Garrett Moss told every pack leader in the east. Then another voice, then another. She kept walking. She walked through the outer gate of the festival grounds into the narrow street beyond, where the torch smoke hung low in the cold air and the drums that had been pounding celebration had gone uncertain and irregular, as if the people playing them had lost the beat. Her personal guard fell in beside her. 3 wolves who had served her for years, and she noticed that not one of them asked where she was going or whether she was all right. They knew she was not all right. They also knew that she was going somewhere deliberate, and that the deliberateness was the thing they were there to protect. She stopped at the corner of the outer ward, in the shadow between 2 torches, and she allowed herself exactly 5 seconds. She pressed one hand flat against the cold stone of the wall, and she breathed, not the controlled breath of the platform, but real breath, ragged at the edges, the body's honest accounting of what the mind had spent the last hour containing. 5 seconds. Then she straightened and she looked at her guard, Bryn, who had been with her since the first border campaign, and Asta and Fell, both trained in the castle guard before she'd requested them specifically. And she said, with complete steadiness, "We're going to the records room, tonight." Bryn looked at her. "My Luna, don't." Not harsh, just direct. "I know what you're going to say, and tonight isn't for that. Tonight is for work." They went. She walked fast through the back corridors of the castle, through the servants' passages she'd learned years ago because they were faster, to the records room, the dry, cold chamber where the kingdom's diplomatic correspondence was held in lockboxes she personally held keys to. Her keys. She had insisted on it, years back, when Kyle had wanted a centralized system managed by his chancellor. She had made the argument about security, and he'd agreed because the argument was good. She had made the argument because she'd known, already, that there might come a day when access to those records was the difference between everything and nothing. She was at the lockbox when the door to the records room opened behind her, and she heard the step she recognized, the particular weight distribution of a man who moved like a former soldier even now, balanced and deliberate. She didn't turn around. "Lord Carvin," she said. "Luna." He stopped in the doorway, then, quietly correcting himself, "Everly." She turned then and looked at him. His face was doing the thing she'd seen on the platform, that complex, self-interested calculation working through whatever it needed to work through. "Your alliances," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mine," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "The Eastern families, the ones you've been working with directly, outside the Royal Council channels. Garrett Moss, the Halstead Pack, the River Traders. All handled through personal correspondence. My correspondence." She held up the key. "In my lockboxes." He sat down heavily in one of the records room chairs, which was unusual enough for the upright Lord Carvin that it told her more about his internal state than he probably intended. "Kale doesn't know," he said. "He knows that things work," Everly said. "He never needed to know why." Carvin rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture so human and unguarded that she found herself, in the middle of everything, almost moved by it. "This kingdom is going to come apart," he said. "If you, I know." "What are you going to—" The door opened again. Holt, Kyle's security chief, stepping into the doorway with the expression of a man who had just come from somewhere very bad and needed to find somewhere manageable. He stopped when he saw Carvin. Then he looked at Everly, and behind Holt in the corridor she heard footsteps. Boots. More than 2 people. Moving with urgency. Everly turned back to the lockbox and opened it. Enshielded in neat ordered stacks were the correspondence files. 10 years of alliances painstakingly built, every agreement recorded in her own hand. She lifted the top folder and opened it, and there was a letter in Garrett Moss's handwriting, and the first line read, "All agreements as negotiated with the Luna remain conditional on her continued authority." She had asked him for that line 3 months ago, when she was still building the picture, still confirming what she suspected, still gathering. He had given it without asking why. She turned to face Holt. Behind him, the footsteps in the corridor had stopped. In the silence, she could hear faintly the drums in the lower wards, still irregular, still searching for the beat. And then, cutting through the night from the direction of the great square, a sound she had never heard before in Ashenvale. The crowd. Not cheering, not the disciplined silence of ceremony. Something else. A roar of voices that had broken loose of its shape, that was moving through the city like fire moves through dry grass, that was not celebration and was not despair, but was something more dangerous than either. Everly looked at Holt. He looked back at her. And in his face, she could see the thing that had been coming for a decade finally arriving. The moment the structure revealed itself, when the weight of everything came down on what the ground was actually made of. She held the folder in both hands. "Tell me," she said, "exactly what is happening in that square." Holt opened his mouth, and from the upper floors of the castle, clearly audible through stone, a voice that she recognized as Kyle's, raised in anger, higher than she had heard it in years, the voice of a man who had just understood that something massive and irreversible had already been set in motion, and she could not make out the words, but she didn't need to. She had written the words, every single one of them. She had written this ending years before tonight. The question that had never been answered, the one she had been gathering information to answer for 4 months, the one that had kept her at her desk past midnight, the one that Celine Voss's presence had set ticking, was not whether Kael would betray her. It was what Celine Voss actually wanted with a kingdom that was already on the edge of coming apart. And from the corridor outside the records room came a sound Everly had not anticipated. Rapid footsteps, lighter than any guard, and then a voice, female, young, clipped with something that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite calm, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone she couldn't see. Everly went very still. She knew that voice. She had spent 4 months learning that voice from a distance, through reports, through secondhand description, through the very particular way Kael's behavior changed when he'd spent time near it. Celine Voss was in the corridor outside this room, and she was not speaking to Kael's guards. The voice answering her was older, male, carrying the particular flat cadence of the Velmark border region, the region directly east of Ashenvale's most contested trade route, the region whose merchants had been making increasingly specific inquiries about the kingdom's treasury allocation for the past 8 months through channels that Everly had flagged, and then quietly continued to monitor because the thread had seemed too important to cut before she understood where it led. Everly looked at Carvin, at Holt, at the folder in her hands, and the 10 years of correspondence inside it, and the letter on top from Garrett Moss that said all agreements remain conditional on her authority. She understood, in that moment, several things at once. That Celine Voss was not simply a woman Kael had fallen in love with. That the timing of her arrival was not coincidental. That the particular disaster coming toward this kingdom in the next 24 hours was not simply the consequence of one man's arrogance, but something that had been planned and positioned and was now preparing to execute. And she understood that she was the only person in this room, possibly the only person in this castle, who had enough information to see it. She closed the folder. "Lock the door," she said. Holt locked the door. The bolt hit home with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, and the corridor went muffled. Celine's voice still audible, but reduced to texture, urgent and low, the specific cadence of someone conducting a conversation they needed no one else to hear. Everly set the folder on the records table and looked at the 2 men in the room with her. Carvin, seated, had straightened again, the brief lapse into human weight already tucked back behind the nobleman's face he'd worn since birth. Holt stood near the door with his arms loose at his sides, the stance of a man who had spent 20 years making himself ready to move in any direction. "How many people does she have with her?" Everly said. Not a question, a request for data. Holt's jaw worked once. "3 that I've identified. 2 more I'm not certain of. Velmark men." He looked at her sharply. "How long have you—" "8 months." She opened the folder to the 3rd page, pulled a single sheet, and set it on the table in front of Carvin. It was a ledger summary, trade route inquiries cross-referenced against dates, names, amounts. She had compiled it herself, working from 3 separate sources she'd never introduced to each other. They started with soft inquiries, merchants asking about tariff structures. Then they got more specific, treasury allocation, guard rotation schedules, the tunnel access below the east wing. She looked at Holt. "Your guards rotated off Celine Voss's corridor 6 weeks ago. Who authorized that?" Holt's face did something complicated. "The Alpha King." "At whose request?" Silence. "At whose request, Holt?" "She made the request through the household staff. I was told the king had approved it." He stopped. Then, with the flat precision of a man recalibrating, "I didn't verify it directly." "No." Everly wasn't accusing him. She was locating the gap, the way you locate a gap in a fortification. Not to blame the stone, but to understand what could come through it. "She's been moving freely in the East Wing for 6 weeks. The East Wing has secondary access to the Treasury Annex and the Military Correspondence Vault." She looked at Carvin. "How much of your Eastern trade volume runs through the Velmark corridor?" Carvin's face had gone the careful gray of a man doing unwelcome arithmetic. 40%, roughly. "And if the Velmark families called their markers tonight, not tomorrow, not next week, tonight, while the kingdom is distracted and Kael is managing a public disaster of his own making, what would the response look like?" A long pause. Carvin picked up the ledger sheet and read it, and she watched his eyes move through it and stop at the same line she'd stopped at 8 months ago when she'd first seen the pattern. "There wouldn't be one," he said quietly. Not a coherent one. Not tonight. No. Everly took the sheet back. Which is why tonight was chosen. She listened to the corridor. Celine's voice had stopped. That was worse than the voice. Silence from people who were in motion meant they'd found their footing, meant they were moving from talk to action. She had maybe 10 minutes before whatever was being coordinated outside that door moved into its next phase. She looked at Holt. I need you to get to Commander Aldrich, not through the castle's main corridors, through the barracks passage below the armory. Tell him the East Wing secondary access needs to be locked and guarded immediately. Tell him it comes from me and that I'll explain why when I can. Don't tell him anything about tonight's ceremony. He doesn't need that to act. Holt looked at her steadily. I serve the Alpha King. Yes, she said, you do. And the Alpha King's treasury is about to be walked out of his castle by a woman he gave his cloak to 3 hours ago, while every guard who should be watching the East Wing was reassigned at her request. She held his gaze. So do you serve him by standing in this room waiting for orders that won't come in time, or by doing the thing that keeps his kingdom from collapsing before morning? Holt breathed in through his nose. Out. The calculation moving through him visibly. The loyalty structures he'd built over 20 years running up against a situation they hadn't been designed to handle. Through the barracks passage, he said finally. Below the armory. Yes. He unbolted the door and moved through it with the silence of a man who knew how to be invisible in his own castle. Everly bolted it again behind him. Carvin was on his feet. If this gets out tonight, if the other lords hear that the treasury was compromised on the same night the king publicly, I know. The Eastern Pacts won't wait for confirmation. They'll pull their commitments immediately. The Halstead family alone. I know, Carvin. She was already moving through the folders, pulling the specific correspondence she needed. The ones with the conditional language she'd quietly inserted over the past year. The agreements that referenced her authority specifically. The letters from pack leaders across the Eastern and Northern territories that amounted, collectively, to a very clear picture of where the actual gravitational center of this kingdom's alliance structure had always been. She stacked them in order. I need you to do something that goes against every instinct you have. He waited. I need you to go back to the square. Right now. Find Garrett Moss. He'll be in the Eastern Noble section. He arrived this afternoon. And tell him I'll send word before sunrise. Tell him to hold his people in the city. Don't let them ride out tonight. Carvin looked at the stack of correspondence. You're going to use them. I'm going to give them a choice, she said, which is more than anyone has given me tonight. He studied her face for a long moment, the way powerful men studied faces when they were trying to determine whether the intelligence behind them was something they could align with or something they needed to defend against. She had seen that look from him before, across negotiating tables, across council chambers. She had always given him the same thing to read, clarity of purpose, and the specific kind of steadiness that comes not from confidence in outcomes, but from absolute certainty about your own next move. He straightened his jacket. I'll find Moss. He left through the records room's secondary exit, the one that opened onto the archive corridor rather than the main passage. Everly bolted that door too and stood in the silence for a moment with the stack of correspondence in her hands and the weight of the evening pressing on every surface of her. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it was useful. It was useful for about 4 seconds. The sensation of something enormous and irrevocable closing behind her, the sound of Kael's voice from the platform saying she reminded me of something real. Not grief, not quite. Something closer to the final piece of a structure clicking into place, a sound you only hear after years of building, the sound of a thing becoming completely what it was always going to be. Then she picked up the correspondence and moved. The route she took through the castle was one she had mapped during the second year of her time as Luna, after she'd understood that knowing a structure's official paths and knowing its actual paths were two entirely different forms of knowledge. She moved through the servants' wing, down the back staircase that led out near the laundry, through a connecting passage that predated the castle's current layout by at least 100 years, and that she had found described in a surveyor's document she'd read while cataloging the archives 6 years ago. She came out in the corridor adjacent to the East Wing's secondary access, the passage Holt was theoretically now securing from the armory side. She stopped at the corner. The corridor was empty, but it shouldn't have been. There were supposed to be 2 household guards posted here at all times during festival events. She had written that protocol herself 3 years ago, after a minor breach involving a merchant's representative who'd gotten into the records annex during the harvest celebration. She had written it, submitted it to Kael's security chief at the time, and watched it implemented. The corridor was empty. She stood very still in the shadow of the connecting passage and listened. Somewhere ahead, a door. Not opening. It had opened. The specific density of sound that comes after a door has moved and the air hasn't settled yet. Soft footsteps, more than one person, with the disciplined quiet of people who had rehearsed this. She had maybe 30 seconds before they were at the annex entrance. She thought about the maps of the East Wing she had memorized. She thought about the Treasury Annex layout. 2 entry points, a ventilation passage that ran along the north wall, a clerk's chamber connected to the annex through an interior door that was rarely locked because the clerks used it for storage. She thought about the correspondence stack in her hands and whether she could get to the clerk's chamber through the ventilation passage in 30 seconds. She couldn't. What she could do was something she had never done in 10 years as Luna, something that went against every instinct she'd developed in a decade of moving carefully, building quietly, working through structure rather than confrontation. She stepped out of the shadow and into the corridor, and she said with absolute calm, "Celine." The footsteps stopped. 3 seconds of silence. Then Selene Voss stepped out from the junction 20 feet ahead, and the 2 men with her, one older, thick-shouldered, with the flat face of a career professional rather than a true soldier, and one young and rigid, hand already at his belt, stayed in position at her back. Celine looked at her. The wide dark eyes were clear and calculating, and Everly saw with a flicker of something that wasn't quite respect but was adjacent to it, that the girl was not frightened. She was assessing. She was doing what Everly would have done in her position. "Luna," Celine said. The title was almost perfectly neutral. Almost. "You don't have to call me that anymore," Everly said. "We both know what tonight means." She looked at the 2 men. The older one had a key in his left hand, an East Wing administrative key, the kind that unlocked the clerk's chamber. She had distributed those keys herself. She knew exactly how many existed and who held them, and this man had not held one legitimately. "You've been planning this for a while." "I've been planning a lot of things for a while," Celine said. "The Treasury Annex," Everly said. "That's where you're going." Celine tilted her head slightly, deciding how much to say. That specific gesture, the calculated partial reveal, told Everly something about her training that wasn't visible in any of the reports she'd gathered. This woman had been taught, by someone with specific expertise, how to negotiate from a position of apparent disadvantage. "The Velmark families," Everly continued, "are expecting a delivery before dawn. Liquid assets from the Northern Reserve Vault, which connects to the Treasury Annex through the accounting passage. Your man with the key was going to go through the clerk's chamber to avoid the main vault guards." She watched Celine's face. "You've done this before. Not here, but somewhere. You have the instincts of someone who's done this before and walked away clean." Celine smiled. It was a real smile, which was more unsettling than a false one. "You're very good," she said. "I know." Everly looked at the key, at the thick-shouldered man, at the young one with his hand at his belt, who was the most dangerous element in the corridor because he was the least experienced and the most ready to prove something. "Here's what I want you to understand. The East Wing secondary access is being secured from the armory side right now. You have maybe 8 minutes before that passage is closed, and your exit is compromised." She paused. "I'm not telling you that to threaten you. I'm telling you because what happens in the next 8 minutes determines whether tonight ends in a way that leaves everyone breathing." Celine's eyes were steady. "You could have sent guards." "I could have. But you didn't." "No." A beat of silence in the corridor, the torchlight making everything amber and shifting, the distant drums still irregular from the square. Celine was thinking, and Everly let her think, because the outcome of this moment depended on Celine arriving at a specific conclusion on her own rather than being pushed toward it, and she had exactly the right amount of silence to work with. "You want something from me," Celine said. "I want the ledgers." Everly's voice was steady and exact. "Not the gold. I don't care about the gold right now. The Velmark payment ledgers, the ones that document who authorized what, when, through which channels. You have them because you needed them as protection." She watched Celine's face. You're smart enough to know that the Velmark families will cut you loose the moment the transfer is complete. You needed documentation of their involvement as insurance. You've been carrying it since you arrived. The thick-shouldered man shifted his weight. Celine did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on Everly. And if I give them to you, then I know what I know, and you walk out of this castle tonight, and what happens next happens without you in a dungeon. Everly held Celine's gaze without blinking. I'm not interested in you, Celine. You're a mechanism. You were pointed at this kingdom by people with longer plans than you, and you were good enough at your job that you got close enough to matter. But the people who pointed you, those are who I need. Celine breathed once, slowly, through her nose. The young man at her back was rigid with the effort of not doing anything, and the thick-shouldered man was watching Celine with the specific attention of a professional waiting for a signal. You have 6 minutes, Everly said, before the passage closes. Celine reached into the inside of her cloak, the royal cloak, Kael's cloak, still on her shoulders, white fur catching the torchlight, and removed a folded leather document case. She held it for a moment, then she held it out. Everly took it. She did not open it. She tucked it under her arm with the correspondence stack, and she stepped back and she gestured toward the connecting passage behind her. The route that bypassed the armory side entirely, the route she had come through, the route that led to the servants' wing, and from there to the castle's eastern postern gate. Go, she said. Celine looked at her for one more second. Whatever she was looking for, confirmation, some visible evidence of the calculation that had just concluded, she either found it or accepted that she wouldn't. She turned to her men with a tilt of her head and moved toward the passage. She stopped once at the entrance without turning around. He's not worth it, she said. Kael, whatever you're about to do, it's not for him, is it? No, Everly said. It's not. Celine walked into the passage and was gone, and the corridor held only torchlight and the distant sound of a kingdom losing its shape. Everly stood where she was for a moment. She opened the leather case. Inside were 4 documents. The first was a payment authorization in Kael's seal, not his signature, but his seal, which meant either forgery or access to the seal itself, which meant access to his private chambers, which meant Holt had underestimated the breach for longer than 8 minutes. The second was a correspondence record between the Velmark Trading Consortium and a name she recognized as one of the senior treasury clerks, a man who had been in his position for 11 years, a man she had trusted with access to the accounting passage. The third was a transfer order for 40,000 in reserve gold, dated 3 weeks ago, stamped with the Treasury Annex counter-signature. The fourth was a letter in a hand she did not recognize, brief and precise, outlining the timing of tonight's ceremony, the distraction it would provide, and the 3-hour window that the distraction would create for the Annex transfer. It was addressed to the Velmark Consortium. It was not signed, but at the bottom, in a different hand, darker ink added later, were 2 words she recognized, not the handwriting, the phrasing, the specific construction, the particular economy of language that she had seen in correspondence for 10 years. 2 words, an instruction, in Kael's hand. She stood in the corridor with the letter in both hands and let the understanding arrive completely, without filtering it, without managing it. She let it land in full. He had known. Not everything. She didn't think he had understood the full shape of what Celine and the Velmark Consortium were building, but he had known enough. He had written 2 words that had opened a door, and he had opened it because the woman he was in love with had asked him to, and he had not asked what was on the other side because asking questions had never been the thing Kael Draven was built to do. She folded the letter back into the case. She thought about the grain agreements. She thought about the water distribution during the well failures. She thought about the border negotiation she had conducted for 3 months while he was in the South, and the campaign reports he'd signed that mentioned briefly that the Eastern situation had been resolved through diplomatic channels. She thought about every brick of the ground she had built, and the man who had been standing on top of it for 10 years, and the door he had opened without looking, and the 40,000 in reserve gold that was now either still in the annex or already moving through the eastern postern. She thought about all of it, and then she walked. Not back toward the records room, not toward the main corridor where she could hear, now, the sound of raised voices moving through the castle from the direction of the square. Nobles, commanders, The entire court trying to find the shape of a knight that had come off its frame completely. She walked toward the barracks, toward Aldrich, toward the one man in this castle whose loyalty had never been to a title or a person, but to the specific concrete reality of whether the people under his command lived or died, a loyalty she had banked on quietly for 6 years by making sure his soldiers had food and wages and equipment when Kael's attention was elsewhere. She walked with the correspondence stack under one arm and the leather case under the other, through the servants' passage, down the back stair, and she thought about the Eastern Territories and the name Alpha Ronin Vale, which had appeared in 3 separate pieces of correspondence over the past year, always in the context of stability, a man other pack leaders referenced when they needed to describe what reliable leadership looked like, a name used as a standard of measure. She had never met him. She had only read about him. But she had read about him carefully, the way she read about everything that might matter, and she knew his treaty record and his pack's defensive posture and the very specific fact that he had never once aligned with the Ashenvale Kingdom despite multiple invitations, not because of hostility, but because, as he had written in a returned inquiry, he had not yet seen reason to believe the partnership would be between equals. She had filed that response years ago and thought, that is a man who understands what he's worth. She understood what she was worth now, walking through the castle she had built the underpinnings of, carrying the documentation that could end a king's reign, moving toward the conversation that would set the next 10 years in motion. Behind her, from the direction of the square, she heard Kael's voice, distant, raised, moving through the castle with the specific pitch of a man who had just found out that something was wrong and was demanding to know what, and from whom, and was getting only the sound of his own voice coming back to him. She did not stop. She did not turn around. She pushed through the barracks door into the cold, torchlit room where Aldrich was waiting with 3 senior commanders, all in dress uniform, all with the same tight-jawed expression. Men who had locked the East Wing access and were now waiting to understand what they'd locked it against. Aldrich looked at her, at the case, at the stack of correspondence, at her face, reading it the way soldiers read terrain, not looking for emotion but for information, for the shape of what was ahead. Talk to me, he said. She set the leather case on the table and opened it to the transfer order. 40,000 from the reserve vault, she said, authorized with the Alpha King seal 3 weeks ago. The treasury clerk in the accounting passage is compromised. The transfer was timed for tonight's distraction window. She set the payment authorization beside it. The Velmark Consortium funded the operation. I have names. Aldrich looked at the documents for 5 seconds. His jaw moved once. Then he looked up at her with the flat, precise attention of a man whose entire professional life had prepared him for a moment exactly like this one, and who had never expected to actually reach it. The Alpha King seal, he said. Yes. I don't know everything he knew, she said. I know what's in front of you, Aldrich breathed. In the silence of the barracks room, the drums from the lower wards pulsed through stone, still searching, still irregular, the whole city in the same suspended beat. What do you need? He said. Lock the Treasury Annex completely. All access, all personnel, until I've had time to audit the full correspondence trail. She held his gaze. And I need you to get word to every pack commander in this city tonight, before dawn, before anyone rides out, that the Luna requests they hold position pending a full account of this evening's events. Aldrich's eyes didn't move from hers. You're not Luna. She looked back at him, and her voice was completely steady when she said, No, I'm not. She picked up the correspondence stack and turned toward the door. But I'm the reason their supply agreements exist, she said, and tomorrow morning, every pack leader in this city is going to find out exactly how much of what they counted on came from that fact. And then they're going to have to decide what that means. She stopped at the door with her hand on the frame. And so are you, Aldrich. She walked out into the night. The cold hit her face, and she kept walking, out through the barracks yard, past the stable block, toward the eastern postern gate that opened onto the road beyond the city wall. The road that, if you followed it far enough, curved northeast through the mountain pass and came out, eventually, into the Eastern Territories. She had not decided yet. She was still gathering. But the gathering was nearly complete, and behind her, in the castle she had built from the ground up, the sound of Kael Draven's voice had reached a frequency she had never heard from him before. a frequency that lived somewhere between command and desperation, and she heard it clearly, and she felt nothing at all except the cold air on her face and the weight of the leather case in her hands and the very first, careful, dangerous beginning of a plan that was entirely her own. The postern gate was unguarded. Because of course it was. She had written the guard rotation herself, and she had written it knowing this gate, on this night, would be the exit she needed. She had written it a year ago. She stepped through it. The road beyond the postern gate was frozen mud and horseshoe scars, and Everly walked it alone for exactly 4 minutes before she heard the rider behind her. Single horse. Moving fast but not reckless. Controlled speed, someone who knew how to cover ground without announcing themselves to everything within half a mile. She didn't stop walking. She shifted the correspondence stack under her left arm and let her right hand hang free and listened to the horse slow behind her. Luna, Bryn. She recognized the voice and let her right hand relax. I told you I was working, she said. You walked out the postern alone with half the castle on fire. Bryn pulled the horse alongside her and swung down in one motion. He was still in his festival uniform, the silver thread catching what little light the road offered. Asta's inside, Fell's watching the records room. I drew the short end. It's not a short end. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him. Bryn had been with her since the border campaign in year 3, when she had ridden to the northern garrison to manage a supply failure that Kael's logistics chain had missed entirely and found a young soldier who asked better questions than his commanding officer. She had requested him specifically for personal guard 6 months later. She had never explained why to Kael. There's a horse at the stable post, Bryn said. 1/4 mile up the road. I put it there an hour ago. She stopped walking and looked at him. You knew, she said. I didn't know tonight specifically. He met her eyes without flinching. I knew something. The pattern of the last few months. The correspondence you were pulling, the way you moved through the castle. I've been next to you long enough to know what preparation looks like different from routine. He paused. I wasn't going to say anything until you needed it. She studied his face in the dark. He was 31 and tired and completely steady, which was the thing about Bryn. He was always completely steady, not because nothing moved him, but because he had made his choice about where he stood so far back that it had become structural. You have a family in the outer ward, she said. Yes. If Kael figures out that you helped me, I know. He said it simply, the way people say things they've already finished deciding. My family will be fine. My brother runs the northern courier route. They'll be with him before morning. She held his gaze for another moment. She thought about what it meant, that the people who had actually seen her work, Bryn, Aldrich, Garrett Moss, Carvin, had all, in their own way, already made the calculation about which side of this to stand on. Not because she had asked them, because 10 years of evidence had accumulated and the evidence was specific and they were people who understood what specific evidence meant. Kael had never understood that loyalty built through competence was a different thing entirely from loyalty built through authority. Authority could be stripped in a night. Competence left marks that lasted. 1/4 mile, she said. Post on the left. Brown mare. She's steady on mountain roads. She started walking. He fell in beside her, and they covered the 1/4 mile in silence. And when she reached the post, the mare was exactly where he'd said, saddled and calm. And she tied the correspondence stack in the leather case into the saddlebag and mounted. Aldrich will hold the annex, she said. I'll make sure he holds the border commanders too. Bryn looked up at her. Where are you going? Northeast Pass, then east. She took up the reins. Ronan Vale's territory. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already worked out. Give me 3 days to get word ahead of you. I'll be there in 2. She rode. The road into the mountain pass was black and cold, the kind of cold that came off the rock faces in waves and got into the joints and the chest and required a specific quality of physical stubbornness to ignore. She had that quality. She had developed it in the winter of year 2, when the Eastern Aqueduct froze and she had spent 3 weeks outdoors managing the repair effort, and Kael had sent a message asking if she was coming back to the capital, and she had written back asking if the aqueduct should fix itself. The mare was good on the switchbacks, sure-footed and even-tempered. Everly rode with her weight low and her mind moving through everything she knew, organizing it the way she organized everything, not linearly but spatially, each piece finding its relationship to the others, the whole picture assembling itself in the space behind her eyes, while her hands managed the reins on automatic. The veil-marked ledgers, the transfer order, the two words in Kael's hand. She kept coming back to those two words. She had told herself, in the corridor, that she didn't know how much he had known, that the two words might have been ignorant authorization, Kael opening a door because someone he loved asked him to, not understanding what was on the other side. She had told herself that because it was possible, and because her discipline had always been to work from what was confirmed rather than what was suspected. But riding alone through a mountain pass at midnight, with the whole weight of the last 10 years pressing on her from every direction, she allowed herself to be more honest than discipline usually permitted. She thought about the specific times over the past year when she had tried to bring treasury concerns to Kael's attention. 3 times. 3 separate conversations about irregular allocation patterns she had flagged through the accounting clerks. 3 times he had listened with the patient attention of a man who had already decided the meeting was going to end without any action required of him. And each time he had said some version of, "You handle it, you always do." She had handled it. She had handled it by continuing to document, to gather, to build the picture. He had handled it by trusting that she would handle it, which was a different thing from trusting her, though it wore the same face. She had mistaken one for the other for a very long time. The pass crested just before dawn, the road flattening briefly before dropping into the eastern descent, and she pulled the mare up and looked back west, back toward Ashenvale. From this height, in the dark, she could see the festival lights of the capital still burning. She could see that they were not arranged the way festival lights arrange themselves, not the warm distributed scatter of celebration, but clustered, moving, the specific pattern of torches carried by people responding to something urgent. She watched it for a long moment, then she turned east and rode. She reached the first eastern settlement, a mid-territory way station called Harrow's Post, in the early afternoon of the second day. She had stopped once, 4 hours into the ride, to sleep against the mare's flank in a shallow rock shelter off the road. 2 hours, enough to keep the mind working. She was stiff and cold, and her eyes felt like they had been sandpapered from the inside, and she was thinking more clearly than she had in years. The way station's keeper was a heavy-set woman named Aldous, who had been managing the post for as long as Everly had been Luna, and who looked at her with the flat, appraising attention of someone who received all kinds of travelers and had stopped being surprised by any of them. "You look like you've come a long way fast," Aldous said. 2 days from Ashenvale. Aldous looked at the mare, at the saddlebags, at the absence of a crown or a royal escort. "There's a room, hot water if you want it." "Water, yes. Food if you have it. And I need to know if any riders from Ashenvale came through in the last 2 days." Aldous studied her. "One rider, yesterday morning, moving fast, relay horse, changed out here." She paused. "He carried the Alpha King's seal." Everly's jaw tightened fractionally. "Did you see what he was carrying?" "Sealed correspondence. Standard dispatch size, 4 or 5 letters." Aldous moved behind the post counter. He asked about the road condition northeast, toward Vale territory. Everly set her hands flat on the counter. She breathed once through her nose and held the information without reacting to it, the way you held something hot until you could find somewhere to set it down. Kael had sent riders ahead. She thought about what that meant in terms of what he knew, what he suspected, what he was trying to do. A rider to Vale territory specifically, not south, not to the border commanders, not to the pack leaders who would be his most immediate political problem after last night. To Vale. There were 2 interpretations. The first was that he was trying to warn Vale away from her, poison the well, establish his version of events before she arrived. The second was something she had not considered until this moment, standing at a way station counter with the cold of the mountain pass still in her bones, and it arrived with the quiet, terrible clarity of a thing that had been true for a while without her seeing it. What if Kael knew about Vale specifically because he had been monitoring her correspondence? She thought about the record room, her lockboxes, her keys. The keys she held herself, the access she had built precisely to prevent this. She thought about Celine's man with the East Wing administrative key. She thought about the treasury clerk who had been in his position for 11 years. She thought about the fact that a compromised security structure didn't stay contained. It spread. It found cracks. It moved through a system the way water moved through rock. She thought about whether, In the years she had been quietly documenting the kingdom's problems, someone had been quietly documenting her. She took the room. She took the hot water. She ate something she didn't taste, sitting at the room's small table with the leather case open in front of her and the Velmark documents arranged in order, reading them again carefully, looking for the thing she had missed. She found it on the third read. It was in the payment authorization, the one carrying Kael's seal. In the margin, in the small precise notation that administrative clerks used for internal tracking, was a file reference number, a standard format. She recognized the format because she had designed it herself, years ago, for the correspondence archive. The file reference pointed to a specific box in the records room. A box she had not opened in the records room last night because it was not one of hers. It was Kael's. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside the way station, the eastern road was quiet in the afternoon cold, the wind moving through dried grass at the road's edge with a sound like something being carefully torn. She had been gathering, she had been documenting, she had been building a picture for months, believing she was the only one holding a brush. She had not been the only one. She had arrived at Vale territory on the morning of the third day, earlier than expected because she had ridden through the second night by choice, not exhaustion. The need for arrival overriding the need for rest in a way that her body registered as urgency, but her mind processed as simple math. The eastern territories opened up after the mountain pass into a different quality of land, lower, wider, the tree line pulling back to reveal rolling terrain that looked like it had never bothered to impress anyone and was better for it. Pack settlements here were built into hillsides rather than on top of them, the architecture suggesting people who understood that height was less protection than integration. The border checkpoint was run by 2 guards and a senior officer, and all 3 of them were awake and alert despite the hour, which told her something about the territory's standards before she'd said a word. The senior officer looked at her, alone, travel-worn, no insignia, and said, "Name." "Everly," she said. Not the title, not the surname. She watched his face. He already knew. She could see it in the micro-adjustment of his posture, the fractional increase in attention. He had been told to watch for her. "There's a rider ahead of you," he said carefully. "I know. Ashenvale Dispatch, carrying the Alpha King's seal. Arrived yesterday." He looked at her steadily, making a decision. "Alpha Vale received the correspondence last evening." He paused. "He asks if you would come directly to the main hall." She rode to the main hall. It was a long, low-ceilinged building of dark timber and riverstone, the kind of structure that communicated permanence through weight rather than height. Inside, it was lit by oil lamps rather than torches, the light steadier and easier on the eyes, and the space was organized practically. Long tables, working maps on the walls, the general atmosphere of a place where decisions got made rather than announced. Alpha Ronan Vale was standing at the central table when she walked in, looking at a map, and he looked up when she entered with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had been expecting her and was neither performing the expectation nor concealing it. He was older than she'd expected from correspondence, mid-40s, solid in the way of men who had been physically active their entire lives without making a production of it, a face that had been weathered by actual weather rather than the simulated hardship of court politics. He looked like the kind of man who read a contract carefully before signing it, which was exactly what his treaty record suggested. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. "Luna Everly," he said, not testing the title, not using it to establish anything, just accurate. "Not anymore," she said. He nodded once, as if this confirmed what the correspondence had suggested. "Then just Everly." "Yes." He gestured to the table. "Sit down. You've ridden 3 days. 2.5. She sat because she needed to and because there was nothing to prove by refusing. She set the leather case on the table. "You received a dispatch from Ashenvale. Last evening, 4 letters. He sat across from her. He didn't move to produce the letters, and she didn't ask him to. "Alpha Draven writes that you have left the kingdom in violation of your bonding obligations, that you have compromised the royal records, and that any pack offering you shelter will be considered in breach of the Northern Alliance Treaty." She looked at him steadily. "The Northern Alliance Treaty has 17 signatories. 12 of them are mine." "I know. And the bonding obligation," she said, was severed publicly by my hand in front of 10,000 witnesses when I removed the Luna's crown and placed it on the throne steps. I know that too. Vale's voice was even and direct, the voice of a man who ran meetings efficiently because he didn't use words to perform things that didn't need performing. There are 2 other letters, one from Lord Carvin, one from Commander Aldrich. She waited. Carvin writes that the kingdom's eastern trade agreements are in a state of suspension pending clarification of the Luna's status. Vale paused. He also writes that 3 noble families withdrew from the royal court overnight and have requested emergency counsel. And Aldrich. Aldrich writes that the Treasury Annex audit found evidence of a systematic compromise going back approximately 14 months. He has the senior clerk in custody. Vale looked at her carefully. He also writes that 2 border garrisons failed to report at dawn yesterday, that the Hollow Creek Pack has suspended its defensive treaty cooperation, and that there are reports of enemy movement along the Northern Ridge. The Northern Ridge. She absorbed this. The Northern Ridge was the kingdom's most exposed defensive line, 30 miles of mountain terrain that the border garrisons existed specifically to monitor, terrain that had been quiet for 4 years because of the deterrence value of the treaty network she had built, terrain that enemy packs had repeatedly probed before the alliances went into effect. 4 years of deterrence. Gone in one night. Not because the military was weaker, because the signal of coherence had broken, because the people who understood that the deterrence was real understood also that the woman who had built it had walked out the postern gate, and that without her the structure was a shell with the load-bearing element removed. She thought about those border garrison wolves. She thought about their families in the settlements along the ridge. She thought about winter supply lines and the water agreements she had negotiated with the Stoneback Pack, and what happened to those agreements if she was no longer positioned to enforce them. She had not let herself feel the full weight of this until now, in this room, with a man who was telling her the facts without softening them. She had been moving and gathering and managing, and the movement had kept the weight at a distance. It landed now. People were going to be hurt. Real people, in settlements she had spent a decade protecting, because one man's arrogance had pulled out the cornerstone. She felt it move through her like cold water, and she let it move, and on the other side of it she found something she had not expected. Not grief, not rage, but something colder and more purposeful than either. The specific feeling she had learned to identify as the activation of a different kind of capability, the kind that didn't build carefully over years but cut directly through the situation in front of it. She had always been the builder, the patient, meticulous, long-game builder. She was going to have to be something else now. "What did Kale write in the 4th letter?" she said. Vale was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the expression of a man choosing his words not to soften something, but to be accurate about it. "The 4th letter was addressed to me personally," he said. "It was not a political communication." "Tell me anyway," Vale breathed. "He writes that you have evidence that could be used against the kingdom, that you are a woman operating outside the bonds of her station with documentation obtained through deception, that any leader who assists you is choosing to undermine the stability of the North." He paused. "And that he knows you spent the last year corresponding with my territory. He writes that he has had your private correspondence monitored for 8 months, and that he has copies of everything." The room went very quiet. 8 months. He had been reading her correspondence for 8 months, every letter she had sent to Garrett Moss, every carefully worded inquiry to the Eastern families, every conditional clause she had built into the alliances to protect herself when she needed to leave. He had watched her build the exit and said nothing. She thought about why. The answer arrived cold and clear. Because as long as she was building it, she was still engaged, still invested, still present. He had watched her prepare to leave and not stopped her because some part of him had calculated that the watching was information and the information was leverage, and he had held it the way he held everything, as a resource, something to deploy at the right moment. The right moment being when she arrived in another Alpha's territory with evidence that could dismantle his reign. The documentation she carried was real, and it was damning, but he had copies of her correspondence. Her private, carefully built correspondence that documented not just the alliances but her intentions, her movements, her communications with pack leaders who were currently in the eastern city waiting for her to send word. If he released those letters selectively, strategically excerpted, stripped of context. She would look like a Luna who had been planning sedition for nearly a year. She set her hands flat on the table. "How many people," she said, "in your territory? Right now." Vale looked at her. "About 12,000 in the main settlement, 8,000 in the outer pack communities." "And your border position?" "Northeast exposure, 2 ridgelines. We've managed it with a combination of treaty relationships and defensive positioning. No major incursions in 6 years." 6 years. She looked at the map on the wall. The Eastern Territories, Vale's position on it, the ridgelines he'd mentioned, the road back through the mountain pass to Ashenvale, the northern ridge where the border garrisons had failed to report. If the northern ridge goes undefended for more than 2 weeks, the enemy packs currently probing that terrain will move south and east. They will hit the Hollow Creek settlements first, then move along the river. Your northeastern exposure becomes your front line within a month. Vale was watching her. "That's your problem too," she said. "Not mine, not Kael's, yours." "Yes," he said. "I'm aware." She opened the leather case and set the Velmark documents on the table. Then she set the correspondence stack beside them. The conditional alliance letters, Garrett Moss's agreement, the full documentation she'd carried out of the records room. She laid them out in front of him with the systematic precision of someone presenting evidence to a council. "This is what I have," she said. "This is what he has." She held his gaze. "And in the middle of both of those things, there are 12,000 wolves on a ridge who have nothing to do with either." Ronan Vale looked at the documents. He looked at her face. He was reading the same thing she was reading, the specific arithmetic of a situation where the moral position and the practical position had collapsed into the same point, where what was right and what was necessary were not in tension but identical, which was either the clearest kind of situation or the most dangerous. He reached across the table and picked up the Velmark transfer order. He read it carefully. He set it down. He picked up Garrett Moss's letter and read it. He set it down. He looked at her for a long moment with the assessment of a man who had been running a territory for 15 years without catastrophic failure and understood, better than most, what catastrophic failure actually looked like before it fully arrived. "What do you need?" he said. She almost said, "I need time. I need resources. I need the eastern packs held and the border garrisons reinforced and the Velmark families publicly exposed before Kael can release my correspondence and control the narrative." She almost said all of it. Instead, she said what was true. "I need you to trust me before you have reason to, because we don't have time to build reason first." The silence stretched between them. Not comfortable, not hostile, but the particular weight of a decision being made by a man who made decisions carefully. The sound of a door being considered from both sides before it opened. From outside the hall, one of Vale's border guards burst through the entrance, breathing hard, in the compressed, controlled urgency of someone who had been trained not to run in public buildings and had decided this was the exception. "Alpha Vale." He stopped, looked at Everly, looked back at Vale. "Rider from Ashenvale, fast relay, changed horses twice." He was holding a sealed letter, and his hand was not steady. "It's not from the Alpha King." Vale looked at him. "Who then?" "It's from Commander Aldrich." The guard set the letter on the table. "He says the northern ridge, 3 garrisons broke last night, not 2, and there are wolves moving south, a lot of them." He paused, and the pause had the specific weight of the worst kind of news in it. "He says it's not a probe. He says it's a push." Everly looked at the letter. She looked at Vale. This was the moment she had been moving toward without knowing it. The moment that made every careful, patient choice she had made over 10 years insufficient, not because the choices had been wrong, but because the world had moved faster than even careful choices could keep up with. And the woman who built structures and read correspondence and worked through systems was looking at a situation that was now beyond structures, beyond correspondence, beyond systems. The thing that had to happen next could not be managed from a distance. She had spent 10 years making herself indispensable while making herself invisible. That was finished now. She picked up the sealed letter from Aldrich and broke it open, and she read it, and when she was done, she set it down on the table with both hands flat on either side of it, and she looked at Vale and she said, "I need horses, I need riders, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to do is not what I was built to do, and I'm going to do it anyway." Vale looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, not admiration, something quieter and more durable than either. The recognition of a person who had just arrived at the edge of what they had always been and was stepping off it. "How many riders?" he said. She told him. He stood up and called his commander. Vale's commander was a woman named Senna, short, iron-haired, with the kind of face that had stopped bothering with expression a long time ago and communicated everything through economy of motion instead. She came into the hall at a controlled jog and stopped at the table and looked at the map and looked at Everly and looked at Vale, and in that sequence of looks managed to ask 3 questions without opening her mouth. 12 riders, Vale said. Fast horses, mountain-capable. Full supply for 4 days. Senna looked at Everly again. Longer this time. She leads, Vale said. Something moved through Senna's face, not objection, not quite. Assessment. The same evaluation Everly had been receiving from competent people all her life. The rapid check of whether the person in front of them was actually what the situation required, or whether they were going to have to manage around them. Everly looked back at her without performing anything. She was exhausted, 2.5 days of hard riding in her bones, and she knew what she looked like. Travel-worn, no insignia, no crown, no escort. She knew the picture she made. She also knew what Aldrich's letter said. 3 garrisons broken. Wolves moving south in numbers that didn't describe a raid, and a secondary note at the letter's bottom, added in a different pen, more rushed. Kael has recalled the capital guard to the palace. He is securing himself. The outer settlements are empty of command. He was protecting the palace. The outer settlements, the farms, the river communities, the small pack outposts that had existed at the edges of the kingdom for generations, were protecting themselves with whatever they had, which was not enough, because it had never needed to be enough before. Because she had made it unnecessary. She had made the deterrent so functional that the border wolves had gotten used to a world where the threat never fully arrived. And now the deterrence was gone, and the threat had arrived, and the muscle memory of managing it had atrophied in exactly the people who needed it most. She had built something that worked so well, it had taught people to stop being ready. That thought had an edge to it that she filed without examining. Not guilt, which was useless, but information, which was not. The next thing she built would account for it. 12 riders, she said to Senna. I need 4 who know the Hollow Creek approach from the northeast ridge. I need 2 who can carry dispatch at relay speed to Garrett Moss in Ashenvale. He should still be in the city, waiting for word, and I need the 6 best fighters you have who can also follow a command they haven't been briefed on in advance. Senna's chin lifted fractionally. The 6. I don't know exactly what we're riding into. I need people who can adjust when the situation changes instead of waiting to be told what the change means. A beat of silence. Then Senna said, 20 minutes. Turned and walked out. Vale was looking at the map. He had a pen in his hand and was marking the ridge positions from Aldrich's letter, cross-referencing with the territorial survey on the wall. And she could see him doing the same math she had already done. The lines of advance, the rate of movement, the window before the Hollow Creek settlements were in direct contact with an enemy force that had broken 3 garrisons. You're not going to the settlements first, he said. Not accusatory, working it out. No. She came to stand beside him at the map. She pointed to a position 6 miles northwest of Hollow Creek, where the terrain compressed into a natural choke point, a river crossing backed by high ground on 2 sides. Here. If they're moving south, they have to cross here or take a 10-mile detour that adds a day. We get here first. We control the crossing. With 12 riders. I'm not planning to fight them at the crossing, she said. I'm planning to talk to them. Vale looked at her. The pack's moving south, she said. They're not a unified force. They're 3 or 4 separate groups that sensed the deterrence break and moved at the same time. They haven't had time to coordinate command structures. They're operating on opportunism, not strategy. She looked at the map. The leadership of 2 of those groups signed provisional correspondence with me in the last 18 months. Not treaties, correspondence. I opened conversations. I didn't push because the timing wasn't right. She paused. The timing is right now. Vale set down the pen. He looked at her with the specific attention of a man recalibrating what he was dealing with. You were already building relationships with packs on the other side of the border. I was building relationships with packs on the other side of a line that Kael drew and I thought was stable, she said. I was wrong about the stability. I wasn't wrong about the value of the relationships. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear horses being brought from the stable, the controlled urgency of Senna's preparations. The oil lamps in the hall moved in the draft from the door. If this doesn't work, he said carefully, then 12 riders is a symbolic loss, and the real problem is still the real problem. She held his gaze. But it will work, not because I'm certain about the outcome, because I'm certain about what I know about those pack leaders, and I'm certain that what they want is not war. What they want is to not be on the losing side of whatever Ashenvale is becoming. She paused. I can offer them something better than winning a raid. What? The same thing I'm about to offer you, she said. A future that doesn't depend on one man's judgment. Vale held her eyes for a long moment. Then he looked at the map, and she could see him making the final calculation. Not about whether to trust her, she thought, but about what kind of trust the situation required. Not faith, not loyalty. The specific, hard-edged trust of two people who understand the same problem and have decided to solve it together because the alternative is worse. He stepped back from the map. I'm riding with you, he said. She opened her mouth. 13 riders, he said. My territory is northeast of Hollow Creek. Whatever happens at that crossing affects me as much as it affects Ashenvale. He picked up his jacket from the chair at the table's end. And frankly, a territorial alpha at the table changes what you can offer them. She closed her mouth. He was right. She knew he was right the moment he said it. The specific clean rightness of a piece of information that lands in exactly the space it fits. No adjustment required. 13, she said. They rode within the hour. The northeast approach to Hollow Creek took them through terrain that shifted from Vale's rolling eastern land into the harder, starker landscape of the border country. The ground getting rockier, the tree cover thinner, the sky bigger and more indifferent in the way of places that had never been fully domesticated. Everly rode at the front with Senna on her right and Vale on her left. The 12 riders behind in a formation that moved with the efficient quiet of people who had drilled for this and were not dramatizing it. Her body was running on something beyond exhaustion now. The place passed the second wall, where the ordinary reserves are gone, and what remains is a different fuel entirely, harder and less forgiving, the kind that burns clean but leaves marks. Her back hurt. Her hands on the reins were stiff from the cold. She didn't attend to either. She was thinking about the two pack leaders. Dravhune led the Ironfoot pack, 40 warriors, historically aggressive on the border but consistently motivated by territory access and hunting rights rather than conquest. She had written to him 14 months ago about a possible seasonal corridor agreement. He had written back in 2 sentences that said he was not interested in Ashenvale's terms. She had written a second letter that said she was not offering Ashenvale's terms. He had not written back, but he had also not closed the correspondence formally. That mattered. Men like Dravhune closed doors that were fully closed. Marit Voss led the Greywater Collective, a looser alliance of 3 smaller packs, around 60 wolves total, female-led, which was unusual in the border territories, and which had historically made the capital's all-male council dismiss her as a minor political factor. Everly had not dismissed her. She had written 4 times over 2 years, each letter more substantive than the last, each one treating Marit Voss as exactly the serious territorial power she was. Marit had written back every time. The crossing came into view at mid-afternoon, the river lower than it should have been for this season, the drought of the previous summer still showing in the waterline, and the high ground on both sides exactly as the map had described. Stone outcroppings on the north bank, good sight lines, natural defensibility, and on the far bank, already positioned, 2 groups of wolves. Everly counted fast. 40 plus on the left bank, clustered under the banner of a black ironfoot on gray, Ironfoot. 60 or so dispersed across the right bank's higher ground with no single banner but a consistent gray-blue token at the collar of each fighter, Greywater. Neither group had crossed. She pulled up the mare 50 yards from the waterline and looked at what she was seeing. They were positioned like people who had arrived expecting to move and had found reason to stop. The Ironfoot cluster had the tight organization of a force under active command. The Greywater wolves were deployed in a wider, looser pattern that suggested awareness of multiple approach vectors, Marit Voss's work. They had both arrived at the crossing and stopped, and neither had crossed, and they were watching each other with the specific attention of forces that had the same general direction but had not agreed on the same plan. Good. Stay here, she said to Vale. He looked at her. 1 rider, alone, is a message, she said. 14 riders is a column. I go first. She held his gaze. If it goes wrong, you'll know within 5 minutes. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he pulled his horse back a step. 1 step. That was Vale. She was learning him fast, the way you learn people when the situation compressed the timeline. He didn't concede easily, but when he conceded, he did it completely. She rode forward alone. She crossed to the waterline and stopped there, in the shallow cold at the river's edge, with the iron footpack on her left, and the grey-water wolves on her right, and the open sky above making everything feel both very exposed and very clean. A rider broke from the ironfoot cluster and came to the opposite bank. Big wolf, thick-shouldered, hard face above a black traveling cloak. Dravhune looked exactly like his correspondence, which was to say, direct and unadorned and carrying the specific weight of a man who did not see the point in the distance between who he was and who he appeared to be. He looked at her across the water. You're not Ashenvale soldiers, he said. No, she said. He looked at the riders behind her, at Vale's territorial colors, back at her. Who are you? My name is Everly. Until 4 days ago, I was the Luna of Ashenvale. I built the northern deterrence that kept your pack on your side of this river for 6 years. She kept her voice flat and direct, matching his register. I'm not offering you Ashenvale's terms. A silence. The river moved between them, low and cold. The deterrence broke, he said. Yes. Because of you. Because of Cale Draven. I was the deterrence. He removed me. She looked at him steadily. Which is why you're here. And why I'm here, and why we're having this conversation instead of the one where your pack crosses this river and the people in those settlements spend the next 5 years recovering from it. Hune's horse shifted. He held it still without looking down. What do you want? I want to show you something better than what you came here for. She pulled the leather case from the saddlebag. I want to show you what the Northern Territory looks like when the people running it are not idiots. From the right bank, a rider came down to the water. Lighter horse, moving with efficient precision. Marit Voss was smaller than Everly had expected, lean and sharp-featured with close-cropped gray-streaked hair and the quick, comprehensive eyes of someone who processed situations faster than most people asked questions about them. She looked at Everly, she looked at Hune, she looked at the riders behind Everly and found Vale and held that for a moment. Ronan Vale, she said. Not to Vale. To Everly. Noting the fact of him. Yes, Everly said. Interesting company for a displaced Luna. Maret's voice was dry and precise. What are you building? Ask me that again in a month, Everly said. Right now I'm stopping a war before it starts, because a war helps no one in this valley except the people who are already gone. Marit looked at her. Hune looked at her. They did not look at each other, which told her they had not been coordinating before this moment and were doing their own assessments independently, which was exactly the gap she needed. She opened the leather case and held up the Velmark transfer order. This is the document that proves the Ashenvale treasury was being systematically stripped by a foreign consortium with access to the royal seal. The kingdom Cale Draven is currently defending from his palace is not the kingdom that exists on paper. It is a shell being held together by momentum. She held Mara's eyes, then Hune's. Within 2 months, without intervention, the northern supply routes collapse, the river trade agreements lapse, and the settlements along this crossing, on both sides, lose access to the eastern granaries. Hune's jaw tightened. Both sides, Marit said. Both sides. Your territory runs its winter supply through the same eastern corridor that Ashenvale settlements use. You know this. She looked at Marit directly. You wrote to me about it 14 months ago. You told me the corridor needed a governance structure that didn't depend on one kingdom's stability. Something shifted in Maret's face, the recognition of her own words. I said I'd consider it, she said carefully. You said you'd consider it when there was someone worth considering it with. Everly held her gaze. I'm asking you to consider it now. The river moved. The high ground held its positions. Ironfoot still clustered left. Greywater dispersed right. Vale's riders behind Everly, in a silence so complete she could hear individual horses breathing. The afternoon light was going flat and gray, and the cold was sharpening with it. Dravhune looked at the document in her hand. He looked at the Greywater wolves on the far bank. He looked at Vale behind Everly. A month is a long time, he said. 3 weeks, she said. Give me 3 weeks and I'll show you a framework that makes this crossing a trade point instead of a fault line. And if you can't deliver, then you're 3 weeks behind on a raid that will still be available to you. She held his gaze. But it won't be available to you, because what I'm offering is better than what you came for, and you know it, and men who know the better option tend to take it. Hune breathed. The calculation moving through him, visible in the jaw, in the set of his shoulders, in the specific quality of the silence a man makes when he is finishing an argument with himself. 3 weeks, he said. She looked at Murray. Murray was already looking at her with an expression that was not agreement, but was something adjacent. The look of a woman who had been waiting for a specific kind of offer for a long time, and was now deciding whether this was actually it or just something that wore its shape. I want the corridor governance in writing, Maret said. You'll have it in 2 weeks. A long moment. Then Murray turned her horse back toward the high ground and the Greywater wolves, and the specific tension in their positioning shifted. Not withdrawn, but no longer pointed. Deflated from a weapon into a waiting. Hune turned back to his cluster without further words. The Ironfoot pack pulled north, away from the crossing, in the controlled movement of a force standing down by command rather than defeat. Everly sat at the waterline alone for a moment, in the cold and the flat light, and she felt the exhaustion hit her in a single wave. Not the managed tiredness of the last 3 days, but the full weight of what the last 4 days had asked of her, landing all at once now that the immediate thing was handled. She breathed through it. Vale came alongside her. He had ridden up while the packs were withdrawing, and he sat with her now in silence, looking at the far bank, and in the quiet she was aware of him as something solid and actual rather than a piece on a board. A person who had ridden out of his own territory on 2 hours' notice because the math was the math, and he had done it. That was not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? I don't know. Something harder. The hard part is coming, she said. That was the part that could be solved by conversation. She tucked the leather case back into the saddlebag. Kael still has my correspondence. He still controls the palace. He still has the legal authority of the Alpha King's title, for whatever that's worth right now, and he will use everything he has to control the narrative before I can get to the council. She looked at Vale. The hard part is Ashenvale. Vale looked back toward the east, toward his territory, and then toward the northwest where the road ran back through the mountain pass. When? He said. Tomorrow, if we ride tonight. He absorbed this. 1 breath. 2. She watched him calculate the territorial implications of riding back into Ashenvale at the head of an Eastern Alpha's delegation, what it would mean legally, politically, personally. And she watched him reach the end of the calculation and stay with the answer rather than look for another one. Senna manages the territory in my absence, he said. He turned to his commander who had come up on his left during the conversation at the waterline. Full defensive protocol. No unilateral movements. Send riders to the Halstead Pack and Garrett Moss. Tell them what happened at the crossing and tell them the meeting point is Ashenvale, 1 week. Senna nodded with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting orders like these since she'd received the first ones. They made camp on the high ground for 3 hours. Enough for the horses, enough for the riders, enough for Everly to eat something and sit with her back against a boulder and look at the stars coming in over the eastern horizon and allow herself to be still for the first time in 4 days. She thought about what was ahead of her. She thought about Kael in his palace, receiving reports of broken garrisons and suspended alliances and the council withdrawals Carvin had triggered, managing the unraveling with the specific desperate energy of a man who didn't understand what had come loose because he had never understood what was holding it together. She thought about what she was going to have to become to finish this. Not the builder, not the patient, background architect of a kingdom that carried someone else's name. Something more direct, more exposed, more irreversible, a woman who stepped into the center of the thing and put her name on it. She had spent 10 years being indispensable while remaining invisible. Invisible was a protection. It was also a cage she had built for herself out of a decade of choosing safety over exposure, and the cage was finished now. There was no invisible left. The festival platform had ended it, not Kael's action, but her own, the moment she set down the crown in front of 10,000 people. That had been visible in a way that couldn't be walked back. She had not understood, in that moment, quite how complete the commitment was. She understood it now. She pulled her cloak around her shoulders and looked at the stars and felt, under the exhaustion and the cold and the weight of everything still in motion, something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Something that sat below strategy and above feeling, something that had no tactical value and tremendous actual value. She felt like herself, not the Luna, not the builder, not the woman who made things work and stayed 4 feet behind the man who received the credit, just Everly. In the dark, having made a choice that was entirely hers. She slept for 3 hours. They broke camp before dawn. The road back through the mountain pass was faster going west than it had been going east. Familiarity compressing distance, urgency compressing time. She rode with Vale on her left and Senna's 6 on her right, and the 2 dispatch riders already ahead of them, burning toward Ashenvale with messages for Garrett Moss and Carvin and Aldrich. She arrived at the mountain pass crest at midday, where she had stopped 4 days ago, and looked back at the festival lights. She did not stop this time. They came down out of the pass and into the western approaches of the kingdom on a clear, cold afternoon, and she could see the capital from 5 miles out. The stone buildings of Ashenvale rising from the valley floor, the palace complex at the center, and above it, the Alpha King's banner still flying. She looked at it from 5 miles and felt nothing about the banner. It was information, not provocation. It told her he was still there, still claiming authority, still holding the form of a thing that the substance had left. What she felt, riding toward it, was the specific clean focus that had carried her through the last 4 days. Not anger, not grief, nothing that required the banner to mean something personal anymore. She felt the weight of the leather case in her saddlebag, the correspondence stack secured behind it, the Aldrich letter, the Vale-marked documents, all of it in order. She felt Vale riding beside her with the straightness of a man who had made his decision fully and was not revisiting it. She felt the 12 riders behind her and the 2 dispatch riders already inside the city spreading word. And somewhere in the city, Garrett Moss waiting, and Carvin with 3 noble families in emergency council, and Aldrich with the treasury annex locked and the documents secure. She had the pieces. What she was riding toward was the moment those pieces came together in front of a council and a court, and a king who had read her correspondence and believed that reading it meant he understood it. He did not understand it. He had seen her words. He had not seen what the words were building toward. He had watched her prepare to leave and thought the preparation was the plan. The preparation was not the plan. The plan was what happened when the preparation was finished and the woman who had built the ground decided to stand on it herself. She was 2 miles from the city gate when the first outriders appeared. Kael's palace guard, 4 wolves in the black and silver of the capital regiment, moving toward them on the road at a controlled canter. The lead rider pulled up 20 yards out and looked at her, at Vale, at the Eastern Territorial colors. "The Alpha King requests your return to the palace," the rider said. Scripted, careful, managing the gap between what he'd been told to say and what the situation clearly was. Everly looked at him. "I know," she said. "He can wait until I've spoken with the Royal Council. The council chambers are currently—" "I know what they currently are," she said. "Tell Kael Draven that his Luna is home." The writer looked at her with the expression of a man who was very aware that the word Luna no longer meant what it had meant 4 days ago, and was not certain what it meant now, and was going to have to go back and report this conversation to someone, and was not looking forward to it. She held his gaze until he turned and rode back toward the city. Then she looked at Vale. "Whatever happens in there," she said. "I know," he said. She rode forward. The city gate was open. The guards at it were standing. And in the space between the gate and the palace, the streets of Ashenvale were full. Not the festival crowd, not celebration, but the specific density of a city that had understood something had changed and was waiting to find out what the change was called. She rode through them with her back straight and her hands steady on the reins and her face entirely calm. And the crowd moved and watched and did not cheer and did not shout, just watched with the held breath attention of people at the edge of something they couldn't name yet. She came to the palace steps, and at the top of the steps, in the black and silver of formal authority, with 24 palace guards arrayed behind him, and the look of a man who had spent 4 days getting worse news every hour, and had decided that the only remaining move was the most direct one, Kyle Draven stood and looked down at her. For a moment, just that. The distance between them. The steps. The cold air. And the watching city. Then Kale said, and his voice carried in the silence with the flat authority of a man who still believed authority was the answer. You don't come back here with an Eastern Alpha at your back and call it anything other than what it is. Everly looked up at him from the base of the steps. What is it? She said. His jaw tightened. Treason. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 2 words in his handwriting at the bottom of the Velmark letter. She thought about 8 months of monitored correspondence. She thought about the guard rotation she had written herself a year ago that left the postern gate empty on festival night. She thought about all of it. Then she reached into the saddlebag and pulled out the leather case and held it up where the guards behind him could see it. Where the council members she could see clustered at the palace's main entrance could see it, where the city, watching from the street, could see it. I have the Velmark transfer authorization, she said. I have the treasury clerk's correspondence. I have the payment ledgers. And I have a document at the bottom of this case that carries your seal and 2 words in your handwriting that authorized a foreign consortium to access your kingdom's reserve vault. She looked up at him. 12 noble witnesses saw me enter this city. Alpha Ronan Vale of the Eastern Territories has requested formal council recognition. Commander Aldrich is holding the treasury evidence under military seal. She held his gaze, and her voice was completely level, and it carried across the palace steps and into the street where the city of Ashenvale was listening. You can call it treason if you want, but the council is going to have to decide what to call it after they read everything in this case. Kale stared at her. For one moment, one single fractured moment, she saw it move across his face. Not guilt, not quite. The specific, terrible recognition of a man who had finally done the accounting he had avoided for 10 years and arrived at the number, and the number was not survivable, and he knew it, and she could see the moment he knew it, in the exact second the certainty in his face went out like a flame in wind. Then his eyes went to the guards behind him, and she saw what he was going to do a half-second before he did it. Take her, he said. The guards moved. Vale's hand went to his sword. Behind her, in the street, the crowd broke its silence. Not a cheer, not a protest. A sound more complicated than both. The sound of 10,000 people choosing. Everly stood at the base of the palace steps, with the leather case in her hand, and the cold air in her lungs, and the sound of the city rising around her. And she did not step back, and she did not look away from Kael's face, and in the space between the first movement of the guards and whatever came next, she felt something that had no name for it except the thing that was true. She had built this ground, every stone, and it was going to hold. The guards came down the steps fast, 6 of them, Palace Regiment, trained for exactly this kind of controlled apprehension, the kind where the goal was compliance without spectacle. They moved with the mechanical certainty of men following an order they had not questioned because the man who gave it still wore the title that made questioning unnecessary. Everly did not move. She stood at the base of the steps with the leather case in her hand and watched them come and calculated the distance and the angle and the crowd behind her and made a decision in the space between one breath and the next. Not the decision to fight, not the decision to run, but the third decision, the one that required the most from her, which was to simply remain exactly where she was and let the moment be what it was. Vale's sword was half drawn when she said, without turning, "Don't." He stopped. The first guard reached her and put his hand on her arm. Firm, not violent, the practiced grip of a man who had been told to bring her in intact. She let him take her arm. She looked up past him at Kael on the steps, and she held up the leather case in her free hand so that it was visible to every person in the street, every noble at the palace entrance, every council member watching from the upper windows. "I came back to your city," she said, loudly enough that it carried. "I came back with evidence. I came back with witnesses. She looked at Kael's face. And you sent guards. The street had gone completely silent. Kael stood at the top of the steps, and the certainty she had seen collapse in his face a moment ago had been replaced with something harder and more desperate. The look of a man who had decided that if he moved fast enough, aggressively enough, the thing coming at him might still be stopped by sheer force of authority. He had always believed that. He was wrong, and he had always been wrong, but he had never had to be right because she had always made the authority work, regardless of whether the belief behind it was sound. She was not doing that anymore. The guard holding her arm felt something change in the crowd behind him. Not a sound, not a movement, but the specific quality of pressure that a crowd generates when it has made a collective decision and is half a second from expressing it. She felt it too, at her back, the city of Ashenvale shifting its weight. Lord Carvin's voice came from the palace entrance, not shouting, the carrying precision of a man who had spent 40 years making himself heard in large rooms. Release her. The guard did not release her. He looked up at Kael. Kael was looking at Carvin, then at the council members clustered at the entrance. 5 of them now, she could see, in formal council robes, which meant Carvin had called them before she arrived, which meant the dispatch riders had gotten through and the word had spread faster than Kael's damage control. The council has not authorized this, Carvin said. He walked down the entrance steps with the deliberate pace of a man establishing jurisdiction through the refusal to rush. She is not a criminal. She is a former Luna who has returned with evidence material to the Treasury breach. Any detention requires council approval. He stopped 10 feet from the guard holding Everly's arm. You do not have council approval. The guard's hand loosened, not because of Carvin's authority specifically, because in the silence that followed Carvin's words, 3 more council members appeared at the entrance, and behind them Commander Aldrich in full military dress, carrying a sealed evidence folder under his arm, and behind Aldrich 2 of his senior commanders. And the picture being composed on the palace steps was a picture that Kael Draven, looking down from above it, could read as clearly as anyone. The guard released her arm. Everly lowered the leather case. She looked up at Kael one last time from the base of the steps, at the man who had stood at the top of them 4 days ago and placed a cloak on another woman's shoulders while the kingdom watched. And she felt, looking at him now, nothing she hadn't already accounted for. Not rage, not triumph. The specific tired clarity of a person who has walked through the worst of something and come out the other side and is now just standing in the aftermath, taking inventory. She climbed the steps. Not toward him. Toward the palace entrance. Toward the council. Toward the work. He stepped aside. She did not look at him when he did it. The council chamber was the same room she had sat in hundreds of times. Long table, high windows, the formal severity of a space designed to make decisions feel weightier than conversation. It felt different now. The weight was different. The people around the table were the same people she had worked with for years, and they were looking at her the way people look at something they had known in one context and were now encountering in another, recalibrating in real time. She set the leather case on the table and opened it. The Treasury breach first, she said, then the Alliance situation, then the Northern Ridge. They worked for 6 hours. It was the kind of work she had always been best at. Detailed, precise, the patient assembly of a complete picture from its constituent parts, answering questions directly and without ornamentation. Aldrich presented the annex audit. Carvin laid out the noble family's formal complaints. The Eastern correspondence was read in full, including the conditional clauses, including the letters from Garrett Moss and the Halstead Pack and the Hollow Creek leadership. The Velmark documents were examined by 2 council members with Treasury expertise who spent 40 minutes in silence and emerged with the specific gray faces of people who had confirmed something they'd hoped was wrong. Vale sat to her right and said almost nothing for the first 4 hours, which was exactly right. His presence was the statement. His silence was the respect. The combination of both communicating to the council that what they were looking at was not a domestic dispute or a political coup, but a restructuring with serious external weight behind it. Kael was summoned at the 4th hour. He came in with 2 of his remaining loyal council members, older men, both of them, who had served under his father and whose loyalty had always been to the position rather than the person, which meant it was already becoming clear to them that the position was in the process of redefining itself. He sat at the head of the table out of habit, and nobody told him not to, and it did not matter, because the head of the table had been irrelevant to who held power in this room for the last 4 hours. He looked at the documents spread across the table. He looked at Aldrich. He looked at Carvin. He looked finally at Everly. "You went to Vale," he said. "Yes." "You used my correspondence against me." She looked at him steadily. "You used mine." Something crossed his face. Not guilt. She had stopped expecting guilt from him days ago, had filed it away with the other things she had believed about him that turned out to be projections of what she'd needed to be true rather than what was. What crossed his face was something rawer and less organized than guilt, something that lived below the architecture of his self-image and rarely surfaced. Loss. Real, undefended loss. She had seen it in his face once before, at the end of the 3rd year, when his father died and he had sat in the empty throne room alone, and she had found him there and sat beside him for 3 hours without speaking, which was the most useful thing she had done that night, and possibly the thing that had held the kingdom steady through the succession transition. She had given him that. She had given him that and 100 other things, and she had given them because she had believed they were building something together. And she had been wrong about the together and right about the building, and the distance between those two things was the exact size of 10 years. He looked at the Velmark transfer authorization, at the 2 words at the bottom in his hand. "I didn't know the full extent of what she was doing," he said. "I know," Everly said. "I opened a door because she asked me to." "I know." He looked up at her. "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "It's not." Silence settled across the table. Outside the high windows, the afternoon was going toward evening, the light changing, the city sounds below carrying the muted quality of a place still processing something large. Carvin spoke. "The council will need to address the question of the Alpha King's fitness to continue." "I'll address it," Kael said. Everyone at the table looked at him. He sat with his hands flat on the table, looking at the documents, and she watched him doing the accounting she had done 4 days ago on the terrace, the full accounting, the one that didn't have a manageable result. And she watched him stay with it, which was something she had not expected from him. Not because she had believed he was incapable of it, but because staying with the unmanageable result was the hardest specific thing that humans did, and most people found a way around it. He was not finding a way around it. "I'll step down from the council vote," he said. "I want it on record that I'm not contesting the evidence." He paused. "And I want it on record that the Treasury breach was facilitated by my negligence and my—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He finished the sentence with the specific, costly precision of a man pulling something out of himself that had never seen air before. "And my arrogance. I authorized access without understanding what I was authorizing because I didn't ask, because I had spent 10 years not asking, because asking wasn't something I needed to do." He was looking at the table when he said the next part, not at her, but it was for her, and everyone in the room understood that. Because there was always someone who knew the answer already. The room was very quiet. Everly held the leather case in her lap, both hands around it, and she let the quiet hold. She thought about what it meant to witness a man understand, fully, the dimensions of a mistake. Not the political dimensions. Those were in the documents, measurable and actionable. The other dimensions, the ones that didn't appear in ledgers, the years of someone's best work flowing toward a center that never acknowledged the current, the specific cost of being treated as infrastructure by the person who was supposed to know the difference. She had carried that cost for a long time. She had carried it without naming it, because naming it would have required her to ask whether the thing she was building was worth what it was costing. And she had not been ready to ask that question until the answer became unavoidable. The answer had been unavoidable on the festival platform when she set down the crown. She thought about what it meant to forgive something without excusing it, not for his sake. She was clear-eyed enough after everything to know that forgiveness was not a gift she gave him. It was a weight she chose to set down for herself because carrying it was no longer useful, and she had too much actual work ahead to spend the energy. She set it down now, in the quiet of the council chamber, without ceremony, without announcement. Just a thing she did internally while the room held its silence, and Kael sat with his hands on the table and the evening light came through the high windows. She set it down and felt the difference in her own chest, the small, specific lightness of something that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. The council voted at the 7th hour. The result was 9-2 for the formal removal of Kyle Draven from the position of Alpha King, the 2 dissenting votes coming from his father's men, who voted no as a matter of loyalty to a principle rather than a belief that they were right. Even they did not look surprised. Kyle signed the abdication document without being asked to sign it. He used the formal seal and his full name, and he did it with a steadiness that she noted because it was real. Not performance, not dignity management, but the actual steadiness of a man who had arrived at the bottom of something and found that the bottom held. It held because he was still there. That was all the bottom had to offer, but it was not nothing. He looked at her once before he left the chamber. Just looked at her, the way people look at things they are not going to see again in the same form. She met his eyes. Not warmly, not coldly, accurately. He left. The work that followed the council vote was 3 weeks of the most concentrated effort of her life. It did not look like the work that had come before it. It did not have the qualities of patience and invisibility that had defined the previous 10 years. It was public, direct, and conducted entirely under her own name, with her own authority, in her own voice. The first week was the Northern Ridge. She coordinated with Aldrich on the garrison reinforcement, using Vale's territorial riders as interim support while the border commanders reorganized around the command vacuum Kyle's palace withdrawal had created. It was logistics, grinding, detailed, unglamorous, and she worked it from a desk in the council chambers and a horse on the road to the ridge and back, sometimes the same day, sleeping when the work permitted it. Garrett Moss arrived in the city on day 3 with 6 pack leaders from the Eastern Territories and a list of trade concerns that needed immediate attention. She met with them for 2 full days in the same chamber where she had spent years sitting 4 feet behind the throne. She sat at the head of the table herself. Nobody commented on it because it would have been like commenting on water running downhill. Marit Voss sent a representative on day 5 with the written governance framework request Everly had promised at the river crossing. She sent back a draft within 36 hours. Marit returned a revised version within 2 days of that. They had an agreement on the corridor governance structure in 10 days, which was faster than anything she had ever negotiated through the old Royal Council, and she understood why as she signed it, because there was no one to manage around anymore, no one to protect from the complexity, no one to translate the substance into palatably simple terms. She could just do the work at full speed. The Velmark Consortium was referred to a formal territorial tribunal, a longer, slower process that would take months and would involve legal structures she had been carefully building relationships with for years. 3 of the consortium's principals had already fled. 2 remained in territory, calculating whether cooperation offered a better outcome than flight. She let the tribunal work. The Treasury clerk was tried through the military council and convicted on the evidence Aldrich had secured. The sentence was exile rather than execution, which was her recommendation, and which the council accepted because she had made the argument that information extracted from a cooperative exiled man was worth more than a lesson extracted from a dead one, and the argument was sound. Celine Voss was not tried. There was nothing to try her with that would hold. She had left before the transfer completed, and the documents Everly had taken were enough to implicate the consortium without needing Celine's testimony. Everly had let her walk out the postern gate, and she stood by that decision, and she did not second-guess it, and occasionally at night she thought about the 2 words Celine had said at the passage entrance. "It's not for him, is it?" And she thought that Celine Voss, whatever she was and whatever she had done, had seen something clearly. Vale stayed in Ashenvale for the first 2 weeks. He worked from a guest chamber in the palace's east wing, the one that had been Celine's, which had struck him as grimly appropriate when she'd offered it, and struck her as practical, which was the difference between them that she found she liked. He attended the council sessions where his presence was useful and absented himself from the ones where it wasn't, and he ate dinner with her 3 nights a week in the smaller council dining room, and they talked about territory management and treaty structures and the specific technical problems of governing a border region in a period of transition, and sometimes they talked about other things. And the other things were where she was still learning how to be in a conversation with him. She had learned over the years to manage her personal conversations the way she managed negotiations, with attention to the other party's position, with precision about what she was offering, with care about what she revealed. It was a habit built for survival in a court where everything personal was also political, and nothing was fully safe. Vale was not a court conversation. He was not managing her. He was not reading her for advantage or leverage or information to use later. He was just present, directly, straightforwardly present in the conversation, saying what he thought, asking what he wanted to know, handling her answers without processing them through a political filter. It took her almost 2 weeks to stop waiting for the filter to appear. On the 14th evening, sitting in the dining room after the council session that had formally ratified the corridor governance agreement with the border pacts, he said, "You're still checking." She looked at him across the table. "Checking what?" "For the thing I want from you, the angle." He held her eyes without any particular intensity, just steadiness. "I've watched you do it in every conversation we've had since the river crossing. You give me something and then you wait for me to use it." She was quiet for a moment. 10 years is a long time to practice a habit, she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same even attention he had given everything since she had walked into his hall. Not performing patience, just actually patient. The way people are patient when they understand that things take the time they take, and rushing them doesn't shorten that. It just damages what you end up with. She said, "I don't entirely know who I am outside of that habit yet." "I know," he said. "You're figuring it out." "That doesn't bother you?" "No." He picked up his cup. People who have already fully figured out who they are tend to stop being interesting. She looked at him for another moment. Then she laughed. Not the controlled social laugh she had developed for court functions, but the real one, which surprised her by how different it felt, how much lighter the chest felt after it. He smiled. A real smile, not a performance of one. The kind that only appeared when something had genuinely reached the face before the face had time to manage it. She thought about what it meant to be known accurately, not idealized, not managed, not viewed through the distorting lens of what someone needed her to be. Just seen, with her habits and her strengths and the specific shape of the work she was still doing on herself, and found not inadequate, but interesting. She had not been seen like that in 10 years, possibly longer. She let herself hold the warmth of it without immediately converting it into strategy. That was new. Vale returned to his territory on the 16th day because the territory needed him, and she needed to do the next phase of the work without the question of him present in the room. And they both understood this without discussing it, which was its own kind of communication she was still getting used to. He said, at the postern gate, the same gate she had walked through 20 days ago with her life in a saddlebag, "When the tribunal is finished." "Yes," she said. He rode east. She turned back to the city. The remaining work took another month. It was not the dramatic work. It was the paperwork, the re-ratification of alliance documents under new authority structures, the careful public communication of what the council had found and decided and why, the rebuilding of a narrative that had been badly damaged by 4 days of chaos and required a clear, honest account to replace the chaos with something people could actually use. She wrote most of that account herself. She wrote it in plain language without the formalities that had always made royal communication feel distant from the people it was supposedly addressing. And she addressed it to every pact settlement in the territory. And she sent it via the courier network that Bryn's brother ran, which meant it arrived with the reliability of a system that had been designed for this. Bryn came back to the city on day 22 with his family and his steady competence and a look on his face when he saw her that was not quite relief and not quite pride and was the complicated thing that sat between them. "You didn't need 12 riders," he said. "I needed 13, she said. "I needed you to put a horse at a post in the dark." He shook his head and went back to work. The Moon Festival anniversary arrived on a clear, cold morning at the end of the month. It was not planned as a ceremony. She had not scheduled it, had not organized a platform or a crowd or a formal address. She had been in the records room since before dawn, working through the last of the treaty re-ratification documents, and she had emerged at mid-morning to find that the city had organized itself. They were in the square, not all of them, not the 10,000 of the festival night, but several thousand, gathered in the cold without being summoned, the way people gather when something has accumulated enough weight that the gathering becomes its own kind of expression. She stood at the top of the palace entrance steps and looked out at them, and they looked back at her, and for a long moment it was just that, mutual, quiet, the particular weight of people who had been through something together recognizing it in each other's faces. She was wearing dark riding clothes and a plain gray cloak. No crown, no silver thread. The silver moon crown was in the council records room, in the formal inventory of the kingdom's historical regalia, an artifact, a document of a thing that had been no longer an active instrument. She had not missed it once. She looked out at the square and thought about the woman she had been on the festival platform a month ago, standing 4 feet from the throne, in midnight blue, waiting for an honor that had never been coming. She thought about who that woman was, what she had been carrying, how long she had been carrying it. She had built a kingdom out of patience and precision and the willingness to remain invisible. And the patience and precision had been real strengths, but the willingness to remain invisible had been a choice she had made so long ago it had stopped feeling like a choice. It had become the shape of her life. She understood now that you could build real things and still be building them wrong. Not wrong in the work, not wrong in the quality, but wrong in the terms under which you offered the work. Wrong to offer it without requiring that it be seen. She had required nothing. She had believed that not requiring anything was a form of strength. Wanting nothing, needing nothing, running entirely on the satisfaction of the work itself. It was not strength. It was a kind of exile she had built inside her own life, furnished with achievement, indistinguishable from strength, until the moment someone handed her a humiliation in front of 10,000 people, and she understood, in that instant, that she had never once made herself hard to lose. She had made herself essential. There was a difference. Essential meant indispensable to the function. Hard to lose meant indispensable to the person. She had confused them, or she had known the difference and chosen the one she believed was safer, because the other required showing someone who you actually were and trusting them with it. And trust of that kind had always felt like the most dangerous thing in a court that treated vulnerability as a target. She had been right about the court. She had been right about Kyle. She had been wrong to let it make her invisible to everyone. She looked out at the square and thought about the next year. The tribunal, the corridor governance, the Northern Ridge refortification, the council's work on a new leadership structure that would not be built around a single alpha's authority. That had been her proposal, submitted 2 weeks ago, and it had generated the most contentious debate the council had produced since the succession, and it was going to pass. And it was going to change the fundamental architecture of how the territory governed itself. It was the biggest thing she had ever built, and it would carry her name. She thought about Vale's territory, Northeast, and the rider system between them that had been routing correspondence for 2 weeks at a pace that was probably excessive for purely diplomatic purposes, and that neither of them had commented on. She thought about what it meant to build something with someone rather than for someone. She was going to find out. She looked down at the square, at the wolves of Ashenvale standing in the cold morning looking up at her. And she thought about what she wanted to say, and then she stopped thinking about what she wanted to say and just said it. "I know what the last month has cost you," she said. Her voice carried the way it always had, not by force, but by clarity, the carrying quality of words that were not performing anything. "I know what it costs a city to lose the shape it's used to, even when the shape was wrong." She looked out at them. Not at a crowd, at people, specific faces, the heavy-set woman from the way station in the northern ward who had been there that morning managing provisions, the older wolf from the Hollow Creek community who had ridden 2 days to attend the governance meeting. "I'm not going to tell you what this kingdom is going to be. I'm going to work on it with you until we find out. That's all I know how to promise." The square was quiet. Then, from somewhere in the middle of it, a single wolf raised his hand. Not a weapon, not a salute, just a hand, open and raised. Bryn's brother, she thought. Then another hand. Then another, spreading outward through the crowd with the organic, uncoordinated quality of something that was not performance but genuine, a city choosing its expression in real time. She stood on the steps and looked at it and felt it move through her, and this time she did not manage what it moved. She let it. The month closed and the new one opened, and the work went on. As it always did, as it always would. Because work was a thing that didn't wait for the emotions to settle and the narratives to resolve and the aching joints of a woman who had ridden through a mountain pass twice in 6 days to stop being sore. The records were filed, the treaties were signed, the courier routes were running, the border garrisons reported at dawn, And on the morning, the tribunal formally concluded the Velmark prosecution with 3 convictions and 2 exile agreements, and the consortium seized assets directed into a border settlement fund that would fund the new governance structure's first 2 years. Everly sat at the desk in what had been the royal correspondence room and was now simply the working room, and she wrote a letter. She wrote it in the direct, unhurried way she wrote everything now, without managing the distance between what she meant and what she said. She wrote to Ronan Vale. She told him the tribunal was finished. She told him the corridor agreement was fully ratified and the first trade convoy would move in 3 weeks. She told him about the governance framework's first formal session, which had been chaotic and productive and had run 6 hours over schedule because the council members were still learning that nobody was going to manage the meeting for them and they were going to have to manage it themselves. And then she wrote, "The East Wing guest chamber is empty. The desk in the second room gets better morning light than it looks from outside. I think you should see it." She folded the letter. She sealed it with her own seal. Not the Luna's seal, not the royal correspondence seal, but the plain wax seal she used for personal correspondence. The one with no insignia, just the pressed edge of a ring she had bought herself in year 1 when she had first arrived in Ashenvale as a young woman and understood she was going to be here for a long time and wanted to own at least one thing that nobody had given her. She handed it to the courier. She went back to work. The morning light came through the window at the angle it came through every morning, long and clean across the desk surface, making the paperwork look almost like something worth the trouble. It was worth the trouble. She had always known that. She had spent 10 years knowing it while the credit flowed somewhere else, and now the credit was hers, and the work was hers, and the name on the treaties was hers, and the ground she stood on was the same ground she had always stood on, built by the same hands. She just wasn't invisible on it anymore. She picked up the next document. Outside, the city moved through its morning. The market opening, the courier horses on the road, the border reports coming in on the regular schedule she had established, the council preparing for its afternoon session, the territory doing the 10,000 small things that a territory does when it is functional and watched over and not currently on fire. She worked. Not for a king, not beside a throne, not from 4 feet behind anyone. She worked because the work was hers, and the territory was hers to care for, and the people in the settlements along the ridge and the river and the eastern corridor were hers to be responsible to. And that responsibility was not a burden she carried quietly for someone else's benefit. It was the thing she had chosen, eyes open, name on it, a queen without a crown. And for the first time in 10 years, in the plain morning light with the paperwork and the courier schedule and the sound of the city doing its work outside the window, Everly was not waiting for something to be honored. She was already home.